So in the last video, I explained why this aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. And what we learned was that when the price levels change, then that leads to what is known as the wealth effect, as well as the interest rate effect and the international effect, which together explain why, for instance, when price levels fall, why does the aggregate demand increase, and therefore you get this downward slope, this inverse relationship between price levels and aggregate demand. Now, what we want to start learning and understanding now is that you see there are many reasons other than changes in these price levels, because of which any of these four components of the aggregate demand and therefore your whole aggregate demand can change. So for instance, if you think of reasons other than price levels, you can just think of an imaginary hypothetical situation where the country that you are analyzing, it gets a new government which is honest and hardworking. And let's assume that government, does good things like spending money and improving infrastructure in the country, providing more stability, ending corruption, and, improving relationships with other countries and all the other good things that overall improve the business climate in that country. Now, when these sort of good things happen, economists would say that, look, the consumer and investor confidence will increase. That is, the households and firms, they will feel more confident about the prospects of that economy. They would feel more confident about the prospects of their own businesses, of their own future employment, and therefore their future incomes. So they would, households, they would start consuming more. So C component of aggregate demand would increase, and firms, they would, since they're more confident, and they would, we assume, start investing more. Now, when this happens, you see what would happen to your aggregate demand curve is that now at any of these different price levels, whatever was the aggregate demand previously, now it would increase. So for instance, if you look at PL1, if previously aggregate demand, which was composed of C1, I1, G1 plus NX1, now if consumers and investors are more confident, then the C1 part and the I1 part of your AD1 will increase, and therefore at PL1, the overall aggregate demand will also increase. And similarly, if you pick another price level, PL2, again, whatever was AD2, now the C2 and I2 component will increase because households and consumers are more confident. It's a non-price factor, regardless of what the price is. They are more confident, and all the C and I are increasing, whether you are looking at, let's say, PL3 or whatever the price level. So the whole aggregate demand, we say, will increase and it will shift to the right. Now here we have just given one example of a non-price factor that may cause an increase in the consumption and investment components, but you can think of many other factors. Now let me keep this graph clean. So you can think of many other factors. So you can maybe think of changing government political priorities. That may affect your country's aggregate demand. Because you see, the government, whenever it spends money, all of its spending is included as the G component of that country's aggregate demand. Now, by changing political priorities, what we mean is that government, in addition to running the economy, have many other responsibilities. And sometimes, not for any economic reasons, but for other non-economic reasons, the government has to change its spending. Maybe there is a natural disaster in the country, there is flooding, so the government has to spend money to provide housing and shelter and food and all the other things to the people who suffer. Maybe the government or the country goes to war, and therefore the government has to increase its spending. So this is where we are saying that because of political priorities that may change, the G component of your aggregate demand will change. So if the government is going at a war and therefore its spending has increased, then regardless of what the price level is, the G component will be more. So at each price level, the aggregate demand will be more than before, and the whole aggregate demand will shift to the right. Now, of course, sometimes the governments may decide to spend less than what they are doing, again reflecting their changing political priorities, in which instance the G component at each price level will become lesser, and the whole aggregate demand will shift to the left. And then you can also think about changing economic conditions in countries that you trade with. That can also influence your country's aggregate demand. So let's assume you are considering the economy of UK. Now UK has many trading partners. UK as a country trades with, let's say, Saudi Arabia, it trades with the USA, it trades with Germany and many other countries. Now let's assume that there is economic growth in Germany as well as USA as well as Saudi Arabia, all the trading partners of the United Kingdom. Now when these economies, foreign countries, they are becoming richer, their economies are growing and people have more money and more incomes, then most likely they are going to buy more exports from UK, since these potential buyers of UK exports are richer. So we say economic growth in trading partner countries would mean that exports and therefore the net export component of your aggregate demand increases, and therefore your aggregate demand may shift to the right. Now there can also be economic recession in all of these countries, which would mean that incomes in these trading partner countries are declining. So they are most likely going to buy fewer of UK exports. In that instance, the net export component will decrease and the whole aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now, I don't want you to memorize all of these things, how these different factors can affect your aggregate demand. Instead, you just need to have a broad understanding that, look, there are many non-price things that can affect any of the components of aggregate demand, and whenever a non-price level thing affects any of these components, then you just need to figure out whether aggregate demand is increasing or decreasing. An increase would shift the entire aggregate demand to the right, a decrease will shift the entire aggregate demand to the left. That is the basic concept that I want you to have. Now beyond that, a good way of thinking about these four different factors that may cause the aggregate demand to shift that I have just explained, one good way of thinking about these four factors is to think of them as sort of natural economic variations that any economy would face. This consumer confidence, investor confidence, government political priorities, economic situation in your trading partner countries, they keep on changing. These are natural economic changes that will be faced by any economy. And due to these natural macro level economic variations, countries' aggregate demand curve, you can say, swings or fluctuates and shifts from time to time, sometimes to the right or sometimes to the left. But what you really need a very good understanding and then a memory of is that you need to understand that in addition to these natural macro variations that may cause the country's aggregate demand to increase or decrease, there are certain tools, or what economists would say, certain instruments in the hands of the country's government. And these governments can play around and use these instruments and change, increase or decrease them to intentionally create a shift in the aggregate demand either to the left or the right. That is, using these certain tools, using these certain instruments, we say the country's governments, the country's central banks, they can control, they can manage the country's aggregate demand. Now these instruments and tools, the important ones that you need to understand are interest rate, exchange rate, income tax and government spending. And we will add one more to that by the end of this video. But what you need is a very, very precise, first of all, understanding and then a memory of how changes in each of these instruments will affect the aggregate demand curve. Will it shift it to the right or the left? So now I'm going to explain each one of these turn by turn. And again, as I said, make sure you memorize all of this explanation of, let's say, for instance, let's start with income tax. How would a change in income tax? This is something which is in the hands of the governments, this tool of income tax. The government can change it, and if they change the income tax rate of the country, the aggregate demand curve will shift. Now, how will it shift? The way you think about it is, it's really simple. You see, let's assume that the income tax rate in a country is 20%. That means if a household is earning an income of 100 rupees, then 20 will be taken away as tax, which would leave just 80 rupees with that household. Now, some terminology here. Whenever you take out tax from your income, the amount left with the households after tax income, we use the word that is the household's disposable income, the income left after you have paid the taxes. Now, coming back to this example, so if the income tax rate is 20%, households are left with 80 once they earn 100. Now let's assume the income tax rate increases to 40%. Now what that would mean is that now if you are earning 100, government would take away 40 in taxes, and therefore your disposable income will fall. And effectively, households will feel as if they have become poorer. They're earning the same amount of income in nominal terms, but once they pay taxes, their disposable income has fallen. And that simply tells us that, look, when the government plays around and changes the rate of income tax, that affects the household's disposable income. And therefore, the households will then start consuming more or less depending on whether you are increasing the income tax or decreasing the income tax rate. So let's assume that the government decides to reduce the income tax rate. That would mean that the household's disposable incomes will now increase, they would feel more rich, and therefore they would start consuming more. So let us put it over here. The consumption component of your aggregate demand will increase, and therefore at any of these price levels, since C will be more, therefore the whole aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Now of course the opposite is true. If the government decide to increase the income tax rate, then the disposable incomes will fall, households will feel poorer, and therefore consumption will fall, and the whole aggregate demand this time would shift to the left. So very, very simple explanation, but it is an extremely important thing for you to sort of, as I said, memorize. And always don't think about it randomly, what will happen to aggregate demand when income tax change. Always maintain this chain of reasoning. When income taxes change, they will affect the household's disposable income, and therefore the consumption component of aggregate demand will change, and you can figure out whether it will increase or decrease, and therefore whether the AD curve will go to the right or the left. So that is the first instrument that you need to understand that the government can use to control that country's aggregate demand. The next easy one is government spending. Now, government spending is it is a component of the country's aggregate demand. Now, I just said at the beginning of this video that the government spending component will depend on governments changing political priorities. But here you have to remember that sometimes many countries' governments will change. They will either increase or decrease the amount of spending they are doing precisely with the intention of just either increasing or decreasing the aggregate demand. Pure economic reason why governments sometimes increase or decrease their spending. There is no political reason behind that. They simply want to control their aggregate demand. So if they want to increase their aggregate demand, obviously they will increase government spending. This G component of your aggregate demand will increase at each of these price levels, and therefore at any price level the aggregate demand will be more. It will be more at each of these price levels, and the whole aggregate demand will shift to the right. Whereas if the government wants to lessen the aggregate demand and shift it to the left, they can start spending less. Maybe they can start spending less on infrastructure projects. Maybe they can start spending less on any other thing that they spend on. So this is an easy one to understand. Let us now move on to the slightly more complicated instruments and how they can affect or help the government control the aggregate demand. So let me now pick up interest rate. Now, interest rate, we have already learned, is the cost of borrowing. So this is again an important thing for you to memorize. Interest rate, it is equal to the cost of borrowing. And the way you think about that is that, look, if you go to a bank to borrow money, then the bank won't hand over money just for free. They will ask you to pay a price, which is the interest rate. So if interest rate is, let's say, 10%, so you borrow money, so the cost of borrowing is the 10% interest rate that you have to pay. Now, when interest rates, let's assume, fall, they can increase as well, but let's assume fall. And here we are assuming that this interest rate is in total control of the central bank. It's not, don't confuse this with the interest rate effect that we talked about in the last video. There we said that when price levels fall, then that falling price level initiates a decline in interest rate and therefore aggregate demand increases. So that was causing a movement along this aggregate demand curve, because it was the price level that initiated the interest rate change, which in turn affected your aggregate demand. So we had this downward movement along this AD curve. Now, when we talk about interest rate as an instrument in the hands of the government, we are saying that, look, price levels are not changing, but the central bank, which controls the interest rate and can directly influence it, increase it or decrease it. Again, we will learn it in A2, how the central bank can achieve this control over interest rate. But here the important thing is, without changing price levels, if the central bank decides to lower the interest rate in the economy, then the cost of borrowing also decreases. Which means that now if you go to a bank and you have to borrow money to maybe spend and buy a house or buy a new car as a household, if you have to consume, it is cheaper for you to borrow. Interest rates are lower. And similarly, if you are a firm and you want to borrow some funds to sort of expand your business and invest in some new project, again, when interest rates fall, cost of borrowing is lesser, so it becomes more attractive for firms to go and start borrowing. So this is where we say that, look, and this is the link you need to remember. Interest rates, when they change, and let's assume they fall, then the cost of borrowing will be affected. And if interest rates are falling, the cost of borrowing will also fall, which would mean that households would borrow more, and therefore the consumption component of aggregate demand will increase. The firms will, remember, also borrow more, and the investment component of your aggregate demand will also increase. And therefore, at any of these different price levels, since C and I components are increasing, the aggregate demand at all of these price levels, it will increase, it will shift to the right. Now, of course, the opposite is true. If the central bank decides to increase the interest rate, then the cost of borrowing will increase, and therefore households will borrow less and consumption will fall. Firms will also borrow less and investment will fall, and therefore the whole aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now, one thing of practical importance that I want you to understand about this interest rate and its effect on aggregate demand curve is that, you see, as far as your essay questions or A-level is concerned, always mention both these effects, that cost of borrowing when it changes due to interest rate changes, both households' consumption and firms' investment, and both of them change. But if you think about reality, always remember that the more important impact of changing interest rate is always on this investment. Because investment is something that fluctuates and moves around more when interest rates change. Yes, households' borrowing does change, but we are saying it doesn't change a lot when interest rates change. Basically, it's the investment component of the aggregate demand that responds, you can say, to changes in interest rate. And that leaves us with the next instrument, exchange rate, which is, again, we assume is controlled by the country's central bank. And central bank, again, can control exchange rate for a lot of different reasons, but sometimes they play around with the country's exchange rate precisely with the target of influencing that country's aggregate demand. Now, how does exchange rate affect country's aggregate demand? You see, the thing that you again have to memorize and you should know from your O levels is that when the country's exchange rate depreciates, I don't want to give you a numerical example. Okay, let me give you a numerical example over here. Let's assume that Pakistan's exchange rate is $0.5 per rupee. A depreciating exchange rate would mean that rupee becomes cheaper, and let's say the exchange rate of rupee falls to 0.2 rupees. Now, let's assume that there is something available in Pakistan, a product whose price is 1 rupee. So let's just keep numbers simple. Now, at the original exchange rate of $0.5, foreigners would have needed $0.5 to come and buy this 1 rupee thing from Pakistan. Now, when exchange rates depreciate, then even if the product's price stays at 1 rupee, foreigners will now feel as if this product is cheaper, because with this depreciated exchange rate, instead of $0.5, foreigners would now just need $0.2. They would get their rupee and they can come and get this Pakistani product whose price is 1 rupee. So that is where we say that, look, when exchange rate depreciates, then local products will feel as if they have become cheaper for foreigners. So the link therefore that you need to remember and memorize is that, let's say, when exchange rates fall or depreciate, your exports will become cheaper and therefore export quantity will increase. And similarly, you can use these same numbers to understand why when exchange rates appreciate, your imports will become more expensive. Pakistanis previously, with every rupee, they were able to get $0.5 and go and shop in other countries. Now with every 1 rupee, they will only end up with $0.2 with which they can go and shop in other countries. So effectively, importing products for Pakistanis earning in rupees become expensive when your exchange rates fall. And that would mean your imports would fall. Now, overall, the net effect would be that the NX component of your aggregate demand. Now, NX component, remember, is export minus import. So if your exports are increasing and your imports are decreasing, then net, this whole thing, export minus import, the NX, it will increase. And therefore, at each of these different price levels, since this NX will be more, so your aggregate demand at each price level will increase, so your aggregate demand will shift to the right. Of course, the opposite is also true. If exchange rate appreciates, exports will become more expensive, imports will become cheaper, and therefore imports will increase, exports will fall, and therefore your NX will fall, and the entire aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now, these are sort of links that, as I said at the very beginning of this video, you need to memorize. Once you understand them, you need to memorize. You need to memorize them so well that with closed eyes, you should be just able to go back and quickly repeat it to yourself. Interest rate, it affects the cost of borrowing. So households borrowing, firms borrowing will change, and therefore consumption investment will change. And you can then work out in which direction will your AD go. And that applies for all the other things. Make sure that you remember these things. If you want to have a cheat sheet for AS macro, this has to be it. We will keep on using it to analyze a lot of different things as we go along. Now, I said I will add one more instrument that the governments can control in order to affect the country's aggregate demand. So let me now bring that in. That last instrument that you need to understand is money supply. Now, the simple way, as far as your A-level syllabus is concerned, to think about money supply at this stage is that, look, the central bank of a country, it controls the country's money supply. And when they increase the money supply, just tell yourself that, look, if the central bank is printing more money, increasing money supply, then somebody in the economy will eventually get that increased money that has been printed. So we say that households, they will eventually have more money if the central bank is increasing the money supply. And if households end up with more money, we assume they will at least spend some of that additional money they receive, so the consumption component of AD will increase. So money supply increases, and then at every price level, the C is more than what it was previously, and therefore at every price level, the aggregate demand increases. The whole aggregate demand will shift to the right. Now, of course, the opposite is true as well. If money supply falls, then households will have less money, and therefore they would consume less than before, and therefore the whole aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now, that is the simple, simplified way of thinking about how money supply affects the aggregate demand. But the real economics that I want you to start understanding from now, because you will have to eventually understand these things in A2, is that, you see, when the central bank, let's say, increases the money supply, pumps more money in the country's economy. When there is so much money going around in the economy, then the price of money, its interest rate, will fall. And when interest rate falls, we will learn as we go along in this course, the country's exchange rate will also fall. So these first three instruments, I want you to remember them independently. I want you to think about it in the way that central bank can individually control interest rate, it can individually control exchange rate as well as money supply. I want you to memorize these things, that how changes in each of these instruments will individually affect your country's aggregate demand. But I also want to then, I want you to have this broad understanding of the reality of economics. That, look, it's the money supply that the central bank changes. Yes, that will directly affect consumption, but that money supply in turn will reduce the interest rates and cost of borrowing, and therefore C&I will increase even further, and that falling interest rate will in turn cause a depreciation of your exchange rate, which will give you another boost to your aggregate demand and shift it to the right even further. And the same is also true when you think about a decline in money supply. When money supply falls, first of all, consumption will fall since households have less to spend. But do remember that the real thing is that when money supply falls, it will also lead to an increase in the interest rate. And that would mean that your consumption investment would fall. Another reason of why aggregate demand would shift left further. And a rising interest rate would mean that your exchange rate would appreciate, which would be then another reason of why this net export part will fall when exchange rate appreciates. So this is something that I just want you to have a broad general idea that these things are linked. But as I said, the most important thing at this stage is to have a precise understanding and then a memory of how these instruments work their way through to these different components of aggregate demand and therefore cause a shift either to the right or the left in aggregate demand of the country.